It finally happened. Ace has been achieved in Paper Mario, and by the most unconventional means of any glitch in all of speedrunning. Already known as one of the most broken games on the Nintendo 64, an Ace glitch had eluded the community, but that was about to change after more than 2 years of glitch hunting. Full of dead ends and roadblocks, the quest for Ace required perseverance, determination, some luck, and a lot of outside-the-box thinking to finally realize the dream the community held dear, the hope that Ace could be achieved in the game. This is the history of the Ace discovery in Paper Mario 64. To understand what's going on in this video, it's good to have an understanding of what Ace is. Ace stands for Arbitrary Code Execution, and it's a type of exploit that allows you to execute code that you want the software to run. In speedrunning, it's typically used to execute a command to wrong warp to the end credits, but it does have other uses, such as this. Quite insane, right? Without getting too technical, here's what's happening with Ace. In programming, there is something called the instruction pointer, which the processor uses to indicate which instruction a computer will execute next in a program. The important thing about the instruction pointer is that it holds the memory address of the next instruction to be executed. So if you can edit this memory address, you can then have the system execute pieces of code that aren't next in line. This by itself doesn't get you a credits warp. There's one other component required, and that's writing a custom piece of code to be executed. So to execute an Ace exploit, there are 2 requirements. Writing some custom code, and then breaking the instruction pointer to execute the payload. We'll look at how the custom code gets written later, so for now, let's start putting together the puzzle pieces of Ace in Paper Mario. When the quest began, Ace wasn't the goal anyone had in mind. In fact, there wasn't even really a quest. People were just looking for new glitches in the game. In particular, a new wrong warp was being sought, as the one runners currently used allowed them to skip most of Chapters 6 and 7 by re-triggering the volcano escape cutscene from Chapter 5. Knowing that they were possible, the investigation was on. If an earlier wrong warp could be found, the game could be shortened significantly, except all the detective work happening wasn't yielding much promise, until this video surfaced. The mysterious video appeared to show a wrong warp that occurs from the Toad Town sewers to the whale transitional cutscene that occurs when you're being transported to Chapter 5. The area in the sewers is only accessible after you have the super hammer, so this would have cut out Chapters 3 and 4 entirely. The only problem was, this wrong warp was fake. When it was first posted, attempts began to replicate what was occurring on screen to no avail. Eventually, one community member named Rain would suggest recreating the video with TAS, at which point the video mysteriously disappeared. Not before a copy was downloaded, however, and upon analysis of the audio, it was found plain as day. There was a splice on the transition to the Chapter 5 cutscene. It turns out that this video was posted not because the wrong warp was possible, but in the hopes that it would attract someone with the technical know-how that could go about finding a successful wrong warp. It was this event that had Rain ask the question, how would you go about finding these sorts of things? And the resounding answer he received was, learn assembly. This was precisely what he set out to do, and it wasn't easy. For someone with no coding experience, this is the most difficult language you can learn to start off. It wasn't an easy path, as resources for learning the assembly language specific to the N64 aren't the best. Rain put in a lot of effort, but he failed to make much progress on his first 3 attempts. Luckily, he had the determination to persevere, and on his 4th go, things started to fall into place, and he was starting to grasp how this low-level language worked. The first piece of the Ace puzzle was now in place, someone that understood the inner workings of the N64 programming language. With his newly acquired understanding of what was going on under the hood, Rain started looking for leads as to where a potential exploit may lie, but his initial findings weren't the most promising. The assembly code for Paper Mario is quite complex, And looking through memory addresses trying to make sense of what you're seeing while looking for an exploit is like finding a needle in a haystack. It was at this point that someone suggested he look at something that was already broken, and there was a glitch that was readily accessible: Huff Crash. Huff and Puff is the final boss of Chapter 6, and he has a mechanic that spawns Tough Puffs when you damage him, equal to the damage he receives. If you spawn 10 Tough Puffs and then use a charged up Tidal Wave by Sushi that isn't lethal to Huff and Puff, the game will crash as the move is executed. This isn't the only crash that can happen in the fight, so it seemed like a great place to start looking for potential exploits. And it wouldn't take long before he figured out what was going on, because data was overwriting code and then getting executed. There were two things required for Ace to be possible: the ability to execute code out of order by messing with the instruction pointer, and the ability to write custom code. The crash was certainly writing custom code, just not the code we wanted, and as Rain looked into it further, he came to one conclusion: whatever was happening here was incredibly complex. It wasn't easy to understand what was going on, and since the crash was happening inside of a battle, what players could do to affect the crash was very limited. It appeared as though Rain's only lead was a dead end. With the two most promising leads appearing to be dead ends, it looked like Ace wasn't very likely, even with one of the criteria being theoretically possible. The restraints in place made it nothing but a pipe dream. It was at this point the community looked to the stars for answers, literally. During an any % bingo race, Morpheus would do three important things. First, he would be inside of the shooting star room. Then, he opened the partner menu. And finally, he went AFK. When he turned his attention back to the screen, he was surprised to see that he had crashed. But why? When you bring the partner menu up, the game is supposed to pause the script that spawns shooting stars in the background, using this command. The problem was that the programmer who wrote this accidentally gave the star spawning script an ID of 0. So when the pause command was executed by bringing up the partner menu, the script just kept running. You'd think this isn't a big deal, but the shooting stars are counted as particle effects, and the game can only handle having 96 of these active in memory. So when it tried to spawn the 97th during Morpheus's AFK, it then crashed. Rain was quick to look into this, and it turns out that the game was once again executing data as code, but there was a major difference this time. As the particle table was filled up and approaching its maximum of 96 entries, the jumbled mess of data would start to execute. But it wasn't just any jumbled mess of data, it was the same data that caused the Huff crash. Rain began connecting the dots on what was going on, and it turns out that this crash found by Morpheus was actually a known glitch that occurred under other circumstances: particle storage. The investigation intensified at this point, and eventually Rain was able to pull off some custom instructions he had created using only this glitch and the game itself. By doing certain actions and making use of this effect storage glitch, he was able to execute a total of 8 arbitrary instructions that told the game to execute NOP, or do nothing in common terms. While this may seem anticlimactic, that's far from the truth, as these tests proved two things: that arbitrary code could be created and executed in Paper Mario, and that it could be done so without crashing the game. I'd like to recap all the insane things that had to happen to get this far. First, we had a fake wrong warp leading to the initial investigation. Then we had two amazing coincidences happen. Morpheus went AFK with the partner menu open in the only room in the game where the particle storage glitch would happen while the menu was open. The stars aligned in the shooting star room. The community had acquired another piece of the puzzle: a method to write and execute code in the overworld, which left one thing: writing code that warped us to the credits. With Ace proven to work in the overworld by writing code and then executing it, the question then became, how do we write code that does something we want to happen? And this is where problems start to arise. It was noticed that the decimal values of Mario's X, Y, and Z position from before an effect was created were getting run as code when the particle glitch was executed. You're probably thinking, great, this solves the problem since we can just move Mario to control the values. Well, not exactly. This only gave us control over 6 bytes, and for technical reasons, this meant we were limited to controlling the first instruction and half of the second instruction being executed, with its end being 0000. One proposed solution was to use something called a jump instruction, which is a command that allows you to jump anywhere in memory, and it only costs 4 bytes, so jumping to values set by controller inputs was on the table. But there was one more issue. You've likely heard of RAM, which stands for Random Access Memory, but there are other more specialized areas of memory that exist, and it was in one of these special memory areas that the particle storage glitch was being executed to. This was a problem. The jump instruction couldn't take you to any memory address. It could only take you to another memory address in this special space. Luckily, there's another command called the jump register instruction, which does allow you to change memory spaces. The jump register requires 2 things, at least one full instruction to load the address you want to jump to, and a full 4 bytes to run the jump register instruction, which we didn't have access to since we only had half of the second instruction, meaning we couldn't just load any memory address and then jump to it. This is where they decided to think outside of the toy box. Rain would be joined by Seedborn, and they decided that instead of setting up a jump register, which requires 4 bytes, they would jump to this address. Since it had 4 zeros as the latter half, they didn't have to worry about the 2-byte limit of the second instruction. But that's not the only thing special about this address. It also happened to reside in the special area of memory that they were stuck in after using the particle storage glitch. And by sheer luck, it was mapped to a function that ran without crashing. The other cool thing is that when a function ends, it will jump to a register called the return address, meaning they could now do the jump register, despite their limitations. Let's recap. They had found a way to set the value for the register address they wanted by using Mario's overworld position for the first instruction, and by Lady Luck's good graces, a way to use the limited second instruction to get a jump register to run. That was a bit technical, so allow me to simplify it. By initiating the particle storage glitch and loading the table up with effects, you can then put Mario in precise positions that will run as code when you close the menu to execute the Ace credits warp. The miracle had happened. Ace was possible, or so they thought. While the logic here is bulletproof, they had one issue. Mario's X, Y, and Z positions are a special type of value called floating point numbers, which can have very precise decimal values, and as they get larger, they become less precise. When they set this up, Mario's X position was so large that it was impossible to get the decimal place value they needed to change the return address register. It seemed that once again, after all their hard work, that the game just didn't want to be broken with Ace. But there was hope. While they hadn't found a puzzle piece, they did find an important method to obtaining one. The aspirations of finding Ace had one last hope. The team was entirely stuck. With no obvious workaround to the X position problem and no new ideas, things were looking grim. This is when Frey popped into the Discord to ask how things were going. A glitch hunter from the early days of Paper Mario, Frey stepped away to create mods for Super Smash Bros., which funnily enough, had him learn assembly on his own, just like Rain, and he now returned with almost a decade of experience. He approached the same problem as earlier, getting execution out of this special memory to a place where it would be easier to manipulate, and then setting up this theoretical execution jump so that it worked. The solution he found was quite unique. He wanted to chain 6 matrices together that would end with execution being jumped to controller inputs. The problem then became setting this up. We knew that controller inputs could already be used as memory addresses when combined with the particle storage glitch. We just needed to find the X, Y, and Z coordinates that would be exact matches to the memory addresses of the instructions for the matrices. You'd think we could just use tasks to find this position and then execute the glitch, but once again, the game decided to fight back. Due to how Mario's Y coordinate worked, his Y position wasn't able to be manipulated freely while on the ground. Luckily, if you could put him on a slope, you could alter the Y position by changing the Z and X instead. As if the stars hadn't aligned enough on this quest, there just so happened to be a tree in this room that had a ton of different slopes, which opened the floodgates for Y positions, literally. Instead of being restricted to a few Y positions, Frey now had millions of possible Y positions, which all resulted from Mario's X and Z coordinates while on the tree. He wrote a script that searched for all of the spots with the correct ZX coordinates, with the hopes that one of them yielded a Y value matching the decimal required. All that was left was to run the script and wait. After searching through millions of combinations, it spat out some possible matches, and as if the stars had aligned for the fourth time, a set of positions was found. The values to execute the matrices were matched. The only thing left to do was to get Mario into those positions, but because of how precise these positions are, it wasn't going to be easy, even for tasks. Remember how Mario's position coordinates were floating point numbers? FPNs are rounded using special math, which is why they get less precise as they become larger. A glitch hunter named MrCheeze discovered that due to the angle of the camera in this room, it was possible to use this floating point rounding to our advantage. By moving Mario away from his current position and then back into it with very small adjustments, you could increment his positions, and with some additional testing, the Ace credits warp was possible. There was just one problem. It was tasks only. The positions you needed to reach were precise down to 4 significant digits, and there were 6 of them in total. The chances of a player getting into just one of them on their own were astronomical. Hitting all 6 in the proper order? Functionally impossible. For now, this method was tasks only, but the puzzle was almost complete. Ace was fully possible in Paper Mario. We just needed a setup that could be done by a player. With Ace being so close to RTA viable, Rain would once again head up the investigation. And if you thought the AFK crash that Morpheus found was lucky, this next setup is something else. A spin in place, then 75 hammer strikes, then closing the partner menu. These were the inputs Rain stumbled upon accidentally. So what do? They spawn 80 particle effects, and then 3 more when you close the menu, as Goombario will move to catch up with Mario. That's 83 effects in the 96 slots contained in the particle table. We already know that when the particle table approaches its limit, it begins to execute data as code, and since Rain started the sequence off with a spin, it's overwriting a different piece of code, which means a new outcome. Ignoring the technical details, we could now use a timer that counted how long you had not moved Mario for as a memory address value, but it had one unique property. The lower 2 bytes were always 4 zeros. Once in position, we only had to watch the timer count until it was at the correct value, which just happened to be on the 69th second. All we had to do was close the menu to make Goombario move to trigger the particle storage glitch, which then jumped execution. There was just one problem. We were out of the special area of memory, but we were still limited by only having access to the upper 2 bytes of an instruction, since the timer method only provided us with values that ended in 4 zeros. This meant that any address we could potentially jump to must have the same ending, and for yet more technical reasons, there were a total of 32 possible addresses that could be jumped to. To make matters worse, half of these 32 addresses are located in the N64 expansion pack, an external piece of hardware that the game didn't even use, so the solution appeared to be another dead end. For the 3rd time, we hadn't found a puzzle piece, but there was something else we could try. If Paper Mario wasn't going to give us Ace on its own, we could always stop and swap to another. This was the point that all hope seemed to be lost for making Ace RTA viable, as every solution just ran into a new problem that seemed to be unsolvable with the tools available. But MrCheeze would have an idea. He's not just a Paper Mario glitch hunter, but has some really big accomplishments under his belt solving some very remarkable problems in other games. And none so much as this credits warp he performed on Game Boy Color. Cheeze knew that on Game Boy Color the RAM isn't erased at power off, but lingers for a small period of time. With this knowledge, he had an idea. If he took a game that already had Ace, he could in theory write some code that another game could then use to execute a credits warp by swapping it into the Game Boy fast enough, provided that game had a glitch that allowed you to jump execution to the code you just wrote into the RAM with the previous game. The reason he knew this is because he had done this with a game called Magi Nation on Game Boy Color. Using Ace in Pokemon, he set up a payload in RAM that allowed him to perform a credits warp by switching cartridges really fast, then setting up a glitch to execute the payload in the other game. You probably see where I'm going with this. MrCheeze had the idea to try this on the N64 with Paper Mario, but he wasn't the first to explore this method. In the 1990s, Rare was developing a mechanic for Banjo-Kazooie called Stop and Swap, which would let you unlock items and abilities in Banjo-Tooie using the same idea by swapping out cartridges quick enough before the RAM was erased. Rare would abandon this mechanic, but it's where the Ace setup proposed by MrCheeze gets its name, Paper Mario Stop and Swap, except it's a bit more involved than what Rare had planned for the Banjo games. There are 3 pieces of the puzzle for this type of glitch to work in Paper Mario. First, we need a game that clears memory on boot. Second, the game must also have Ace. And third, we need a way to jump the execution in Paper Mario to where we've stored the code we're making with Ace in the other game. Since the first puzzle piece requires a game with Ace already possible, that limits the pool quite significantly. And of those 3, it just so happens that one of them clears RAM on boot. But like everything else in this video, it's not so simple. While OOT did reset RAM at boot, it wasn't a perfect candidate out of the box for some technical reasons. Luckily, these could be solved using the 4 additional megabytes of RAM provided by the expansion pack. The solution in the previous chapter involved memory addresses in the expansion pack's memory, and since OOT didn't require the pack to run, it never made use of the extra RAM. This was great for our purposes because the RAM inside of it was cleared on boot all the same, which gives us the first piece of the puzzle. Almost. We had Ace and RAM cleared on boot. We just needed to write a code payload with Ace in Ocarina of Time to use in Paper Mario. This is easier said than done, and it started in Paper Mario with the save files, as the value being written in Ocarina of Time would be a jump instruction to where the file names themselves were stored in Paper Mario. By writing in some very specific names to each file, you could set up a payload that would set the room ID and then save the game, with the obvious room ID being the end credits screen. The OOT part was a bit trickier, as you're using Ace to write code for Paper Mario that would use the save file payload, but the team was determined and enlisted the help of SaveState, an Ocarina of Time runner and glitch hunter who created the entire OOT setup for them with nothing more to go off of than, we need this value at this memory address. This was a lot to take in, so let's recap. The file names in Paper Mario can be used to write a small payload that sets the room ID to the end credits screen and then saves the game. The OOT Ace instructions are a jump command to run that piece of code, which just leaves one thing: executing that jump instruction. Fortunately, we had just the setup to do it. Rain's 1 spin, 75 jump plus hammer swings, then closing the partner menu after a precise amount of time had passed, followed by a jump. At long last, everything was in place for Ace to be realized in Paper Mario RTA. It was just going to come down to who could get it first. The race was on. Shortly after the TAS-only method was made, the setup for the Stop and Swap version would be explained to runners, and using a Game Shark, they were able to simulate the payload from Ocarina of Time. Jcog would start doing runs with the payload already loaded in, and after struggling through some attempts, this happened.
Oh, that's it. Oh, let's go!
The theory was proven. Ace was possible on console. It just needed some help from Ocarina of Time, which meant Jcog had some learning to do. There have been a lot of videos made about Ace and Ocarina of Time, which I'll link below, as the things required to perform it are quite technical, and for our purposes, we're doing some slightly different things in the game since our goal isn't to warp to Ocarina of Time's credits, but to the Paper Mario credits. All you need to know is that very specific actions and the use of some game-breaking glitches are required, and the OOT setup takes about 30 minutes to complete, which brings us to the stop and swap run itself. Since this is a Paper Mario run, the runners decided that it must start with Paper Mario, so they would begin the game and get to the point where the Goomba King would retreat into his castle and then load up Ocarina of Time. For the next 30 minutes, they ran through the setup for getting the Ace payload into the expansion pack's cleared memory, and after completing it, they performed the swap. Since this is on console, they had no way of knowing if the swap worked until they executed the final glitch. Lots of things could go wrong here. Waiting too long on the swap, a single small mistake during the OOT section, or an error in Rain's execution method, which we should look at again. To initiate the glitch, it's not as simple as doing a spin jump followed by the other inputs. You need to trigger the particle storage glitch somehow. And that's where ImGlower comes in. Glower is the current record holder for Paper Mario, in all categories. To say he's a master of the game is an understatement. He discovered that with a specific setup at the Goomba King fight involving the blue trigger block, you could trick the game into opening the partner menu while you still had control in the overworld, which then allowed you to create effects and fill up the particle table. This is why runners took the first boot of Paper Mario to the Goomba King fight. It's the earliest known location where players can perform the particle storage glitch, and once they finish the OOT setup, they're just one screen away from setting it up. Initiating the glitch isn't the easiest thing to do, and you can see Jcog struggle and have to reset. This is because it's a frame-perfect trick, where you're trying to open the item menu on the same frame that you interact with the blue switch in the bush. After performing that glitch and winning the fight, you'll want to open the partner menu right as the camera starts to zoom out, as this will allow you to retain control of Mario while everything else is frozen, which means it's time to store some particles. If you follow Rain's setup, you'll crash when you close the partner menu and perform a jump. A quick reset will let you know if you've done it right, as you'll be able to tell from the file select screen. There are issues. As I mentioned earlier, you won't know if any of your previous setups across both games are wrong until you crash and reset on the final step. And this certainly gave Jcog some grief as he did attempts. He ran into problem.
Not first try Goomnut, unfortunately.
After problem.
That's good. What, really? How was that? Okay. It's fine, minor setbacks. This is the only frame perfect input left.
After problem.
Late.
It didn't look like he was going to be able to pull it off. Eventually, he made it all the way to the end of a setup, but for some reason, it just didn't work.
Come on. Why didn't it work? Is there something we don't understand about this? That looked good to me.
Time was running out. He couldn't stream forever, and he wanted a sub 1 hour run. He had time for one more attempt.
Oh! 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 Let's go!
That was it. Paper Mario 64 had been beaten using Ace with some help from Ocarina of Time and an abandoned Banjo-Kazooie mechanic. Glower would set the record in this stop and swap category just a few days later, with the discussion currently raging about what category this should occupy on the leaderboard. The biggest question is if a setup will be found that doesn't use OOT, as that would reduce the time significantly and make this a standalone game with Ace. Most importantly, we should remember that this all started by the efforts of one person, Rain, who kept the dream of Ace alive through determination, perseverance, and some help from friends along the way. Thanks for watching.